I'm going to introduce Robyn Silvestri, our Executive Director, and she's going to go ahead and take care of the program.
So before we begin, I just wanted to give a shout out to some people who are in the audience joining us today. We cannot do this alone. It is a group effort, and Save the Great South Bay is all about collaboration and working with other organizations to amplify our efforts. So I'd like to recognize that in the audience we have several of our key partners that we work together with here, including CTUC, the South Shore Estuary Reserve, Stony Brook School of Marine Atmospheric Sciences, and CORNELL Cooperative. So if we could give them a round of applause for all their efforts here on the Bay. And I'd like to introduce some of our legislators who are, or local political officials who are in the audience today. We have representation from Senator Wake's office, Assemblyman Gandolfo, and Andrew Garbarino's office, who represents Congress. So thank you guys for joining us today. Again, the support of our local officials is key to our efforts, so we really appreciate working together with them. And then I'd like to introduce some of our board members, and our board members are not only the ones who are here, but they are extremely dedicated to our mission. They volunteer every minute of their time, so I want to give them a special welcome. Wayne Horsley, thank you, Wayne. Tom Kane, who runs our Creek Defender program. Andy Herschel, who runs our Great South Bay Oyster Project. Todd, you've already met, and Rihanna Quinn-Roddy, who runs our development. Again, I can't say enough about their dedication to the organization and their passion about protecting this. I mean, we love to host our events here because the view, literally the name of the place, represents what we see here and what we're here to restore, first of all, and then protect and preserve for our future generations to enjoy. So we have a great panel today that I'm very proud to introduce you to, and I need my glasses for this. I'm going to start with Michael Misson. He's an oyster farmer out on the bay here as part of the Islip's aquaculture leasing program. He has been an oyster farmer since 2015 along with his family. He is a member of the Farmer Veteran Coalition, a national nonprofit group dedicated to helping veterans get started in farming, both agriculture and aquaculture. We do a word of the week as part of our outreach educations, and aquaculture is simply farming different products out on the bay. Then I'd like to introduce Rob Vasiluth. Rob has a very unique position on the board. He's an eelgrass restoration innovator. He is, Rob, what do you do for your regular work?
I'm an engineer.
He's an engineer, but in his free time, he has developed a methodology for planting eelgrass in the bay, which is very unique. I'm sure you'll hear more about it. I don't want to be a spoiler up here. But Rob had a devastating experience on 9/11, and he turned around and committed himself to saving life, which in turn led to an adventure in eelgrass restoration. He's a father of 3, and he invented a hugely important process for bringing back vital aquatic vegetation. He works together with students on the east end of Long Island, and we look forward to working with him with schools across the South Shore of Long Island. Then we have Steve Heck. Steve is a PhD candidate at the School of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences. And he is investigating how human activities drive changes in coastal marine ecosystems. He has research-based scallop restoration efforts in Nantucket and studied genetics effects on the population dynamics of sea scallops on the eastern seaboard. Over the past several years, his interest has focused on how habitat characteristics and transient predators influence the structure of seagrass communities. So thanks, Steve, for joining us today. We're excited to have you. Next up is Jeremy Campbell. He's the manager of the Long Island Estuary Reserve. This is a Department of State, and he is responsible for working with local stakeholders such as Great South Bay and Friends of Bellport Bay to implement local priorities focused on water quality, living resources, economy, which is really important to everybody who lives here on Long Island, resilience, and the public use and enjoyment of the estuary. Prior to coming to the New York State DOS, Jeremy worked at the DEC for 16 years, focusing on water quality issues. And then up next we have Steve Schott. Thanks for joining us, Steve. Steve is the Marine Botany and Habitat Restoration Educator at CORNELL Cooperative Extension. Steve manages all eelgrass monitoring programs for CCE and oversees eelgrass restoration fieldwork and greenhouses. He also maps eelgrass meadows from historic and current aerial photographs. This is really important so we can see where we were and where we are now and where we need to get back to. He's a community resource for seagrass and algae-based issues. On a personal note, he loves doing anything on the water, so join the club. And then finally, we are honored to have Chris Pickerell, who's going to moderate today's panel discussion. Chris is the Marine Program Director for CORNELL Cooperative. He has nearly 3 decades of experience relating to the assessment, monitoring, and restoration of coastal habitats. Specific experience relates to seagrass, salt marsh, shellfish, and near-shore terrestrial environments. His seagrass work has involved working on both coasts of the U.S. as well as in Europe. So I hope you'll join me in welcoming all of our panelists and our moderators. The format of this event is approximately an hour of panel discussion, and then we'll save 15 minutes at the end for audience Q&A. So please hold your questions to the end. We will end promptly at 10 o'clock. There is another event coming in here shortly after us, so we need to clear out. So thank you for your support in that. And if you could, because I always forget this, leave your name tags at the front desk. We recycle them. Thank you.
Thank you, Robyn. And thank you, Todd, as well. And thank you all for showing up this morning. I wasn't expecting such a large crowd. I thought maybe there'd be 10 people here, but I think it's a testament to this organization and to the partnerships and to you all that you took the time to come out this morning. So thank you for that. I did have a few words that I wanted to say before we begin the panel discussion. And as Robyn said, I've been working on eelgrass for about 30 years now. Started my job in '93. So it's literally 30 years, I think, this coming April. And a lot of that has focused on plant material restoration, in particular eelgrass. And if I can say anything about eelgrass, it's that it is very, very, very challenging. And there's no harder species to work with. And we'll go over some of the reasons for that as we talk through this morning with this distinguished panel. But what I wanted to make sure that you know as well is the critical nature of eelgrass as a habitat in all of our estuaries, in our nearshore environments. And it is unique in that it is an ecosystem engineer and that it alters the environment within which it grows. So it changes water flow patterns, sedimentation, it provides habitat, three-dimensional structure on the bottom. If you were lucky enough to live when there was a lot more grass, or there was grass in the bay, you would know that as you would run your boat or your sunfish, whatever it may be, over an eelgrass meadow, the water was clear. And that's because it was settling out those sediments, settling out the algae and things like that. So it's important to think about that. We want to get back there. And I like to say that it's not something, well, I shouldn't say I like to say it, but I often say that a bay bottom without eelgrass is like a forest without trees, and it really is, because the lack of that habitat is a real problem. A couple things I wanted to bring up as well. I brought some props here. You heard about the prop stopper. Everybody knows what this is. This is obviously a propeller, but you may or may not know that in the early 20th century, Columbian Bronze, located in Freeport, just down the road here, developed what they called the weedless wheel. And that's what this looks like. So you've all seen propellers that look like this. They had to, because the grass was so thick in this area that you couldn't run a propeller through it. And you can read testimony from the ferry captains that would say they'd have to go forward and backward just to get through these eelgrass meadows. Another thing developed by Columbia Bronze is called the South Bay Strainer. So the old ferries had inboard engines. They still do, actually, but they have to bring in water for cooling. This was developed, made out of bronze, to keep the grass out of the intake for that cold water intake for the cooling system. So that's how much grass there was. They had to put these on. So that's it's a testament to the amount of grass that was there. In terms of restoration and what's happened here historically, going back to the 30s, this was one of the locations for the first restoration efforts in this country. So there was a wasting disease that occurred in 1931 or thereabouts. Soon thereafter, the United States Department of Agriculture Bureau of Biological Survey did some plantings of eelgrass near Jones Beach, and they used plants from Mecox Bay, from Virginia, and from the West Coast, from Washington State of all places. And the only plants that seemed to survive were the ones from Washington. Now, we don't know if they contributed to the gene pool, but they very well could have. So that was in the 30s. Moving into the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of work beginning in this area because it had kind of died back for about 30 years. But then we have the pioneer Jerry Churchill from Adelphi, who I think of as kind of the grandfather of working with seeds. We hear about Bob Orth and others that have done work more recently, but Jerry Churchill was really the pioneer, and he's still with us today as far as I know, but he did some amazing work, so he needs to be recognized. By 1987, we had a brown tide in the Peconic Estuary, and my organization, before I was there, held a seagrass restoration workshop, brought in people like Bill Dennison and Mark Fonseca, which if you're in the field, you know these names. So anyway, I'm not going to speak anymore. What I want to do is start to get to the panel discussion. And my first question is for Stephen Heck, which says, what has your research taught us about the value of eelgrass, and how does this relate to shellfish populations?
Thanks, Chris, and thank you all for having me today. As far as the importance of eelgrass, as Chris mentioned, it's certainly incredibly important for many commercial and recreationally important species. Those include bay scallops, clams, all sorts of crabs, blue crabs especially, black sea bass, lots of juveniles of all sorts of different species need it for protection from predators and all sorts of other things. The other thing that eelgrass provides us with, as Chris mentioned, is as it photosynthesizes, since it's a plant, it's drawing down carbon dioxide and making the water less acidic, which in turn helps calcium carbonate forming organisms like scallops, clams, oysters make shells. And so that's essential for their survival, especially at smaller life stages.
Thank you. With regard to restoration, I wanted to ask Steve Schott a question, because that's kind of one of the reasons for this discussion. What kind of factors dictate project success and failure? We've been doing it for many, many years, so we know how to fail, that's for sure.
Unfortunately, but you definitely learn a lot of lessons. So thank you everybody for having us here, and we'll hear about some methods that are being used, novel methods. But really, one of the things that we can't overstate with seagrass restoration in general is site selection. The problems we're having in many coastal regions is that our water quality at this point in time, due to human issues or climate change, which is ultimately a human issue, have changed the environment to the point where eelgrass or seagrasses are having difficulty surviving or can't survive anymore. So, as Chris said, we've done this for a long time, and what we used to do was, again, Robyn mentioned, I look at a lot of old aerial photographs, and I can tell you, I did a complete survey from 1930 aerials for the Peconics. There was 12,000, almost 13,000 acres of eelgrass. Pretty much anywhere where it was within the depth range that you would expect to find eelgrass, there was. We don't have that now. But when we started doing restoration, we were looking at those areas going, oh, eelgrass grew there, let's try replanting it there. And a lot of our funders wanted eelgrass to be planted where it historically had been. The problem is the eelgrass doesn't grow there, it didn't stop growing there, and there was a reason for that. And we don't necessarily know if those factors are still, in effect. So you can overcome that by test plantings, but that's a lot of effort. So we look at site selection as like 95% of the story. If you can find a good site that will support eelgrass based on parameters, we use things primarily, the primary parameters are temperature. So eelgrass is a cooler water tolerating plant, so we're looking temperatures below 77 degrees for more than, say, 30 days out of the growing season. which most of you that are familiar with Great South Bay, it's like a bathtub down here in a lot of places unless you're close to the inlets. Eelgrass doesn't do well, it starts to become stressed. So we try to vet out those areas that are too warm. We also have problems with light, brown tide. Eelgrass is a photosynthesizing plant. It needs a lot of light. These are the primary and easy to get at factors to tell whether or not a site may be or has the best potential. There's other factors: sediment quality, sediment type, how much organics. We don't want to plant in places where people are going to pull their boats or are going to clam, because we put the plants in the bottom and then someone comes along the next day and digs them all up. So there's a lot of factors to that, but really site selection and looking at key parameters, and that's something with the new project we're working with the South Shore Estuary Reserve. We're going to be developing a model of the entire South Shore Estuary that will look at these factors and kind of kick out maps that tell us where those best places are, that we can start to focus back in and look at these sites to do restoration. And those models have been completed in the Baconics and Long Island Sound, and they're very valuable tools. So.
Perfect segue into my next question. That is to Jeremy. What is the SSER Blue Carbon Project, and how might it help bring eelgrass back, as we all want it to come back?
Technical difficulties here. So thank you for the question, and thank you everybody for being here this morning. So the Blue Carbon Initiative, it started probably the idea of it, around 2017, 2018. We completed a survey of eelgrass in the South Shore Estuary Reserve, and the results of that showed that from 2002, which unfortunately was the last time we had done a survey, we had lost 50% of the eelgrass just from 2002 to 2018. With that, and also everyone, practitioners, CORNELL, Bradley Peterson, who's here, and others, all saying that we didn't have any data on seagrass within the South Shore Estuary Reserve, and what we can do to restore it. There's been a lot of data lacking, within the South Shore Estuary. So we came up with an idea, looking at seagrass and its benefit, also with restoration to blue carbon sequestration, and looked at what can we do to start to protect and try to restore what we have left here in the South Shore Estuary Reserve. We have roughly, based on our 2018 survey, from Hempstead all the way to Southampton, roughly 10,000 acres. That was from a 2018 survey. Obviously it's 5 years later. I don't know exactly what that number is. I don't know if anybody actually knows what that number is. It could be more, it could be less. Based on trends, we may assume it's less, but there's also been increases in places like Shinnecock Bay, successes in Moriches and Bellport. So what we're doing is working with CORNELL throughout the entire estuary, and Steve was mentioning some of the aspects of the project. We're going to be looking at some sites, some test sites, which I believe are Bellport Bay and Moriches, and in Shinnecock, I believe, that they've done some restoration, and see what based on some sampling, gathering some key information, where we can potentially look to restore seagrass throughout the estuary, and then also look for new locations throughout the estuary that are prime for the opportunity to try to set up new beds and see how they succeed. And if they don't, we'll look in other places, and that's where the model that Steve just mentioned is going to come in, and that's going to be this overall is going to be a 5-year project. It started last April. They got one season in. We're going to be starting the second season, and we're hopefully this is going to be successful and teach us a lot of valuable provide us a lot of valuable information to move forward with restoration in the estuary moving forward. So that that is the Blue Carbon Initiative.
Great, thank you. I want to go off script a little here and put somebody on the spot, and that's Dr. Bradley Peterson, who was. So would you mind coming up here just for a minute to talk about your monitoring for Fire Island and what you're doing even out east, because it's so important.
In 2006, the National Park Service worked on coming up with a way of monitoring the eelgrass resources within their parks, not just at Fire Island, but all of their parks that have submerged aquatic vegetation. And so Hillary Nichols from USGS came out, and we began setting up this water quality monitoring project there. And so since 2006, every other year, the water quality within the boundaries of the Fire Island National Seashore has been done during July, the growing period. And also then they have these specific ways of looking at kind of the spatial extent of where the seagrass is, and most importantly, having areas where they try to look at what's going on, what's driving the changes. And so they have these protocols they put in place that since 2006, they've been looking at these same areas over time. And it's given us insight into the park boundary, but as been mentioned earlier, the park is one portion of Great South Bay, and so having kind of a unified plan across the boundaries of the park would give excellent information for understanding, there's not one answer everywhere in Great South Bay as to what's causing the problem. So anyway.
Can you just briefly speak to some of those reasons that you're seeing come out of the data?
So I'll talk about two potential issues. So very near to where they have their permanent monitoring site, and I want you to think of it, they have these 3 lines, and these lines are all at different depths, and they've been monitoring along these same lines, same exact places over a period of time. And so what they want to do is see what's going on at the shallow edge and at the deep edge, right? The idea is the deep edge kind of integrates the light stress, right? And so if things are getting bad with light, we'd expect that deep edge transect, things would start going bad before other places, right? If it's a temperature issue, then we would expect that in those shallow areas, up in the shallows where the warm gets the warmest, we might see issues going on there. And what was very interesting is that we saw that in the deep edge, there was grass that was dwindling, and at the shallow edge, the eelgrass was dwindling, right? And then what did we have in 2012? We had a huge punch hole through the inlet, right? And immediately the water got clearer and the water got cooler. And so you saw the grass on those transects respond to that cooler and clearer water, right? So this was it was a great kind of way to validate that technique that they used to monitor would give ideas on what was happening.
Perfect. And that kind of ties into, thank you very much, ties into some of the work that many of us have done, in that when we do our test plantings, we do them with depth. So we're looking to see, being too shallow, you have adequate light, but maybe get eroded out, and then when you're too deep, you don't have adequate light on that side. So anyway, moving on to restoration methods, I want to ask Rob a question. What have been the biggest challenges to you developing and implementing an innovative eelgrass restoration method? I mean, the short list.
The short list. Well, thanks for having me. Thanks for the question. It's toughy. Pretty much everything with developing a method to grow eelgrass has been challenging. But luckily, I got the jump start working with you, Chris, back in 2016. And you let me come into the lab and test out my idea that I had. And,
it sounded crazy, I have to say, but we get a lot of those.
I am known to be a little crazy, but I just really thought this was a good method that I came up with that would work. And you gave me the opportunity, and I didn't miss the opportunity. So that was a challenge in itself. Having an idea is great. A lot of people have ideas, but to be able to, test an idea, that's a challenge. Just to get, to have a facility with saltwater flowing tanks and to have these seeds, and then to, just to be able to have access to work there, and that was a challenge. And luckily, I was able to do that. And moving on, it takes a long time for eelgrass to grow from seeds. It takes quite a bit of time. It takes a good 6 months from the time I put them in the water in November. And that's a long time. So there's no instant gratification. So another challenge was having patience to see if it was working. And then once I was able to see in the lab that it was working, I had the challenge of doing this work in the open water. And to do the work in the open water using clams.
So would you just take a moment to describe your method, because not everybody knows what this is, so please do.
I invented a method to grow eelgrass seeds by using clams. I attached the eelgrass seeds using a very strong superglue that's biodegradable and non-toxic to the outside shell of a live clam, particularly a hatchery clam that's New York State approved and safe.
You have to say that.
Have to. And so we don't want to transfer diseases from one wild area to another wild area. So we use New York State hatchery approved clams. So in this innovation, once the seeds are glued to the clam, we simply drop it off into the water, the clam falls down to the bottom, and then the clams bury themselves. They'll bury themselves to a depth that just happens to coincide with the depth that's needed for an eelgrass seed to be safe in an underground and under the sediment environment, and then be able to sprout and then make it to the surface. And then once that happens, once the seed sprouts, it's no longer connected to the clam. And the clam can move around without harming the eelgrass plant. But the innovation is it's a nature-based engineering solution. It's using the natural engineering of clams. Clams are engineers, so when they bury themselves, they're taking oxygen into a sediment that could be devoid of oxygen. And when it does, it makes it conducive for a plant to grow, and it makes a good habitat for the clam to hang out in. So that oxygen turns to sulfide, which is an environment that's not conducive for eelgrass, or really anything that lives, and it converts it into sulfate, which is really good for plants, and it's really good for shellfish. And then the excrement from the clam gives nitrogen to the plant, which the plant needs. And the plant readily absorbs, it makes it grow fast. And then the plant's given oxygen in the water column that the clam needs. And then the clam's constantly filtering out the water, which is allowing more sunlight to come through. So it's like a symbiotic relationship that they have, and all I'm doing is kind of forcing a clam to sow seeds. So I'm using an animal to grow an underwater meadow is the innovation. So in challenges, there's a lot of challenges growing eelgrass. Site selection, permitting, and then having the ability to get these clams, to store them, to get the seeds, to collect seeds is a challenge. And then to be able to monitor it and see how it's doing. So far to date, I have 5 open water plantings that I've done with the help of CORNELL Cooperative Extension and STONY BROOK, and I've had a lot of help from a lot of friends. I haven't done it all myself. I've been pushing the innovation, trying to develop it, and what I've been doing is scaling it. So it's great if you can plant a couple plants, but what we really need is 10,000 acres restored in the Great South Bay. It's a big number. And to be able to have any innovation for growing eelgrass, it has to be scalable. So I'm trying my best, which is my challenge now, which is to scale it to a rate that makes a real dent. So that's the biggest challenge I'm on now is how to get 10 million seeds, how to get 1 million clams to glue them to, how to get the volunteers, how to get the funding, how to have the facilities to do the work. So there's nothing but challenges.
And this is assuming that you have sites to do it in. So we have to do the site selection to find those sites that are suitable for any method, because what we've found is that we've developed methods not quite as innovative as yours, but it all depends on site selection. So without those sites, nothing's going to work. So you can have the best site in the world, anything will work. If you have the poorest site, nothing will work. So it all kind of has to work together to do that modeling and figure out where we can actually plant it. So that's going to be another limiting factor, which we've talked about over the years.
And a couple of the other biggest challenges is in the last 7 years, the temperature of the water has gone up dramatically, which really is a really big challenge for eelgrass to survive that. So we have to have that site selection to know where the water temperature is going to be just right, that it will, our efforts won't be wasted. But my goal would be to have the ability to plant 100 acres a year with my method. I don't know if I'll get there, but that's another challenge.
Sounds like you're determined. Something's going to happen. Thank you. So continuing on the theme with shellfish, I wanted to ask Mike whether he sees the overall goal of restoring eelgrass to the estuary as a good thing for aquaculture or competitive? Is there a conflict of interest in terms of use of space, or what are your thoughts about eelgrass in general, just as a oyster farmer? And just let us know.
Well, I was wondering what you were going to ask me about. I don't know anything about eelgrass at all. So I was curious why they had me sit up here, but I'm glad you came up with something. Good for you. No, the only impact eelgrass has on a commercial operation or any leasing of bay bottom is the state doesn't let you use that area. So if you're successful, you'll put us out of business. So
if we plant where you guys are working, which we
if
wouldn't do, nobody would do on purpose.
If eelgrass takes up and spreads and overruns our site, which is only 95 acres, so you have 21 farms living on 95 acres. If 95 acres gets overrun with your seed, I hope, or whatever, we're out of business. But I'm not worried about that. I'm sure we'll, because of the good we do to the water, that I'm sure DEC in their infinite wisdom will figure out a way to let us coexist.
I think the bay's big enough for all of us.
I hope so.
Yeah, really
just leave us 95 acres. Otherwise,
It's a little tight, yeah.
I joke, but you'll take a picture from satellite one day, and you're like, how come there's no seagrass in that 195 acres? That's because we're out there every day raking the stuff up because we don't want to be out of business. But you didn't hear me say that.
Yeah,
so.
but nobody heard that.
Oysters probably make the water more suitable for
That's right. So we're working against our own self-interest.
Yes,
yeah.
No, it's true.
But I never heard of that clam thing. I thought that was a great idea. That's the first thing I had. I've been somewhat interested in the bay stuff, so I don't know. You got to promote it some more. I think because that's a great idea.
Yeah, I wanted to get Steve in.
Yeah, just along the same lines of what you're saying, that's certainly a concern. Like when you apply for oyster farm lease and all that stuff in the East Coast, pretty much any state, in the Northeast, but the Pacific Northwest actually has policy that allows oyster farmers, when you set up your farm, you can't have eelgrass on there, but if it comes in, given the mutual benefits that, oysters and eelgrass have, they let you retain that same lease. So I think that should be a policy change.
Our lease specifically says if we find it, we have to notify them and move. We're not allowed to operate out of that area anymore. So if we get overrun, we'll have to.
Yes.
I'm not worried. We'll change it as the time comes.
So the Pacific Northwest had reacted. I don't know what the time frame is, but basically, if eelgrass comes into the oyster farm plot, you don't have to move. They recognize that it has a mutual benefit there. So it'd be cool if that happened here.
Yeah, exactly. It'd be a good problem to have, I guess.
Yeah, Steve, before you put that down, I wanted to ask you about the relationship between shellfish and eelgrass, the bay scallop, the hard clam, refugia, that kind of stuff.
Oh, yeah, definitely. So I was thinking about this after you asked me that question before, but there's a ton of research out there that shows that among other species, bay scallops are highly dependent on eelgrass for survival. So eelgrass bay scallops, when they're really small, when they're juveniles, they actually, when they're in the water column as larvae, or maybe I should go back for a moment, because bay scallops, when they spawn, the eggs get fertilized, they drift around in the water column for about 2 weeks, kind of going all over the place. And then as that larvae settles, it preferentially settles on eelgrass and other, biogenic habitat, so other plants. And as they grow, they actually will, either stay on that eelgrass, but they, even if they're not on eelgrass to begin with, they'll actually swim up into the water column, attached to eelgrass at small sizes, and that allows them to escape predation. So having eelgrass around ups their survival by, orders of magnitude at times. And then as I was saying before, the fact that eelgrass photosynthesizes, it also helps species like scallops, clams, and oysters sequester calcium carbonate out of the water column to form shells. And then as far as clams go, kind of the same thing. That complex structure that the roots or the rhizomes of the eelgrass form actually make it harder for predators to consume those clams and ups the survival of clams as well. Yeah.
I just wanted to add one thing. You brought up the bay scallops, and I haven't seen anything in the news, but I could tell you from firsthand that all of us farmers, for the first time over the last 2 years, 2 years in a row, we're finding scallops in our gear, and that's never happened before. So we've never had a wild set, and I'm at it going on, 9 years now? And so just the last 2 years. So we're popping open our bags, and we're finding scallops, and we're taking pictures and putting it on Instagram. So look at
Is
what we
that
found.
summer or fall?
Well, we find them all throughout the year. I mean,
Okay.
I don't know. We pop our bag. We put our bags out, and we don't touch them for months, except to split them. So they may go unnoticed for 3-4 months, but we're seeing them, and we've never seen them before. That's a new development. So I don't know what's going on.
That's great. You go?
Yeah, and I hadn't heard that, but to kind of go back a little bit too, and just to reiterate, scallops, clams, oysters, and eelgrass, they're mutually beneficial. As these bivalves are filter feeding, they're also, enhancing the clarity of the water, which allows eelgrass to photosynthesize. It has more light, so as it's a plant, that's better for it. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you. Steve, why don't you just relay the story about the whelks and the hard clams off of Shelter Island? Remember that years ago when we saw they were massive hard clams? Yeah.
So one of the things, and I'm sure Stephen's seen it as well, in eelgrass meadows, you get some of the largest clams in those meadows because they've been protected for so long. So we're seeing, East Hampton Town used to have their largest clam competition, and people were getting their largest clams from the eelgrass meadows in Napeague Harbor. Unfortunately, they were also tearing up our eelgrass meadows in Napeague Harbor. So there, what we were seeing in one meadow particular off of Shelter Island was as these meadows were starting to thin out in an area where conditions had changed to the point where the grass was just starting to be stressed. Some of the sediment was getting lost, so now these clams are sticking out more, and I'm assuming that the current is carrying their chemical cues further. And we were diving one day, and it was like you'd find lines of knobbed and channel whelks just beelining right for the meadows. And they get into the edge of the meadow, and then they dig underneath, and then it's almost like molehills in an eelgrass meadow. So there were so many large clams and had attracted such predators as the meadows died back. And we've seen this in areas of meadows where the meadows have died. As the sediment erodes, now that the meadows aren't holding it, a lot of the fines, all of a sudden there's these large clams just laying on the bottom. And hard clams will survive for a period of time not being able to bury themselves. The larger the clam, the more difficult or impossible it is to dig itself back in. I guess it's a mechanism of the size of the foot versus the size of the shell. So it's usually chowder clams that you see on the bottoms, but it's amazing, as said, this refugia and how effective it is. You could just judge that by the age of the clams that are actually surviving in these meadows, and then when they do break down, the predators, how fast they find it and come in. But that's the story. It literally reminded me of looking at my lawn and seeing molehills, and it's just when you dug them up, it was just a whelk hunting, or if it didn't already have a clam, it was close to one. So and unfortunately, that did not help the meadows conditions either. That's one of our problems as well. Fractioning and and causing patchiness in meadows, especially if they're under stress. It's, I think back to chemistry, the more reaction surface, the faster the reaction goes. So the same thing. So we've seen that with prop dredging, with natural animals, bioturbation, people digging clams and creating this patchiness. And if a meadow's stressed already, it tends to hasten the situation. But
So it's kind of like forest fragmentation, the same concept. And also there's a density factor as well. Once you get below about 100 shoots per square meter, it seems like these things destabilize and they kind of disappear. So the example I was asking Steve to describe, I remember seeing it, and it reminded me of going to a sand pit with a dirt bike, just doing circles. There were literally whelks just digging up the eelgrass, and they were powering through, almost like they were plowing, and the eelgrass was on the surface. So what was left was being dug up and displaced to the side, and then there were these gaping, huge monster clams that were there that had, succumbed to the predation by these whelks. So.
we ate well for a while.
Yeah, we were top predators in that case.
Can't let them go to waste.
Yeah, exactly. Jeremy, I want to go back to you and just ask you about SSER and what's happening in terms of engaging the community in terms of education around seagrass, and we've got this big project. Like, how do you foresee us integrating with the community and reaching the children and the adults and groups like the folks here? How can we increase and enhance that?
Well, I think an event like today is a perfect opportunity to educate everyone about seagrass for one. Two, that's going to be one of the main pieces of our project. At the end, we did include a education and outreach component to the project. We've also done, through the Department of State, we are, a state entity, and with the Department of State, we did a couple years ago a internet-based story map on seagrass that I believe Robyn's going to be sending around if she hasn't already to everyone after the event today. But I think one of the key challenges though with eelgrass, and I think it's we had this question when we started talking about the project, and I think I've had it with other people. Does everybody know what eelgrass is or seagrass is, other than just thinking seaweed? And how do we bridge that gap and get people educated to understand its importance and why we should, be caring about it as much as, water quality or wetlands or, whatever it may be that's important to us. But why is this thing you can't see that's under the water that you just see on maybe a prop? Why is it important? How do we educate people about something they can't really see, other than showing them pictures, and then they have to believe you that, if it's not a tangible thing that you can see, it's very difficult oftentimes to educate people about it and get them to understand the importance of it. I think there's been, also, kind of compare it, to a lot of the other issues on the island, water quality wise, trying to get people to understand these, complex issues. You just don't, there's not tangible things or things that people typically talk about, whether it's, especially in the water quality world, and certain things are just not talked about. When, you talk about habitat here, I know shellfish are really easy to get people interested in. So if we can somehow make that, and everyone hasn't, they've seen it, they've eaten shellfish, so it's easy to connect to. Just how do you connect to the seagrass, the eelgrass that we're talking about, and make that connection to get people interested. And I think we're, for one, it's great to have, Save the Grass South Bay, having an event today just to talk about eelgrass. And I think that's one of the, another reason why, doing the project, across the entire estuary, not just doing something in a regionally, very, targeted area of the estuary is important. We want to look to do and expand eelgrass from, like I said, from Hempstead all the way out to the town of Southampton, throughout the estuary. So I think, education and how we go about it, and how we, be able to, answer that, get people to understand that one key component of why it's important and what it is, and get that understanding is key.
We have just touched the tip of the iceberg here. Can I please have a big round of applause for this amazing panel? Thank you, everybody. And if you need any more information, please go to savethegreatsouthbay.org or contact Robyn by email. Thank you very much for coming.